Previously, I laid out some of the things that I believe are positives, pros about Mexico. Now, I'm going to go through some of the things that, in my opinion, hold Mexico back. First of all, if you ask anyone who's Mexican about their own country and ask them, what is the biggest problem in Mexico? Political corruption is always going to be at the top of the list. There are three main political parties that operate in Mexico. One is called the PRI, which stands for Institutional Revolutionary Party. Another is called the PAN, which is the National Action Party. And then a third is the PRD, which is the Democratic Revolutionary Party. Over the last 100 years, the way politics have played out in Mexico is like this. Throughout the entire 20th century, one single political party, the PRI, won every single presidential election. Now in Mexico, presidential elections are held every 6 years, as opposed to in the United States, where they happen every 4 years. And unlike the United States, you can only be elected president once. But throughout the entire 20th century, every 6 years that they had a presidential election, the PRI won the election. Now, was this because Mexicans were excited about what a great job the PRI was doing? I don't think there's any doubt that the PRI occasionally won some of these elections, but the last few in the 20th century were heavily disputed elections. And then in the 2000 election, the PAN won, the National Action Party won. And they took over from 2000 to 2006, and then they won again in the 2006 election. So they stayed in power until 2012. I spoke to many Mexicans about this, and while they were optimistic about this turn towards what appeared to be democracy, their hopes and expectations as a result of getting rid of the PRI were very high. And I believe many Mexicans felt that they were going to just turn a page very quickly and switch over, and suddenly everything was going to be okay. But corruption goes back for a very, very long time in Mexico. Really, it generally gets pinned on the Spanish, but I don't think that we can really look at the Aztecs or the Maya or any of the other great Indian societies there and think that they were somehow egalitarian societies, because they were not, and they were certainly not democratic societies. And then in the 2012 election, the PRI won again. So they took over again from 2012 to 2018. And in the most recent election, the 2018 election, the PRD won. So we'll see if the PRD brings great changes to Mexico. It's a very difficult thing to switch over because, of course, it's not just a matter of a government changing. You have to make sure that people who are corrupt go to jail. And many of these people are spectacularly wealthy people, and they can make sure that they buy their way out of issues, including buying off the police and buying off the judiciary and buying off anybody else they would need to buy off. The corruption really in Mexico historically has gone from the top all the way down to the bottom. As many of us know from having gone down to Mexico and driving our car, when you get pulled over by the Mexican police, oftentimes what happens is you pay a quote-unquote fine, but this fine is something that you pay in cash on the spot. No one writes you a ticket. You don't get any receipt for that. And so the ability to track what's happening goes way down. What else? Well, in the 20th century, population growth was very rapid in Mexico. Since 1965, the population has gone through an almost 250% growth. Now, currently it's slowing, which is a positive sign, but let's take a look at these graphs. So on the left-hand side, we have population 1951, and on the right-hand side, we have population in 2000. And if we look at this population in 1951, in Mexico, there were 28.7 million people. In 2000, there were 98.9 million people. So a significant population increase over those 50 years. But notice this, population growth in 1951 was about 2.88%, whereas in 2000 it was at 1.45%, which obviously is decreasing. If a country is growing at 1% annually, it will double its population in about 70 years. Now, if we look at population in 2020, notice that the population is about 129 million. I like to say 130 million, just rounding. Those sorts of numbers are not, it's not critical that you understand and memorize the number. I want you to understand things in a proportional way. And then notice that the population growth rate has now gone down to 1.06%. Just by comparison, Canada has a higher growth rate than Mexico does. So the growth rate in Mexico is definitely going down. That's the trend. That's a positive. The problem was the population grew very rapidly in the 20th century. And what you always have to think about when population growth is happening quickly is this: where are those people going to get jobs as they reach maturity and they need jobs? If there's not jobs now, hoping the jobs are going to fall out of the sky is foolish. Another problem is this, that about 50% of the population of Mexico works in what's known as the informal sector of the economy. So we can generally break economies up in a number of ways. One of the ways is to describe either the informal or the formal portion of the economy. The formal portion of the economy is the recognized and taxed aspect of the economy. In other words, you get a paycheck and your taxes are already taken out of it. So if you work at Target, or you do what I do for a living as a teacher, or you're a doctor, or you're a lawyer, or you work at McDonald's, any one of these jobs, you're getting a paycheck. The informal economy is unrecognized, untaxed, and in addition to that, generally you are paying in cash for everything. And about half the population of Mexico is operating in the informal sector of the economy. Now, if you look at this gentleman on the left-hand side, this picture was taken in Mexico City traffic, and what he was doing, and there were a number of people doing this, was he was going on, he was wiping down the cars, because there's a lot of dust in the air in Mexico City, and then he would come up to somebody whose car he had just wiped down, and he would put his hand out and he'd want a tip for this. He didn't ask in advance, he did it sort of playing on your sympathy. And the woman to the right-hand side, this is in Chapultepec Park in Mexico City, she sells these little cornbread tortilla-like things, and you can see that she has this little crate. She puts everything inside there. She has a little coal stove there that she's, or hot plate thing that she's cooking on. And she cooks these things. You can see the businesses behind her. Those all have a legitimate right to be there. But she would have to watch out for the police. And when the police came along, she would throw everything inside of her wooden crate. And then she would take off and wait until they were gone and then come back. Otherwise, she has to pay a fine for this. The question becomes, what happens when these people are sick? They don't get any sick pay. What happens when they want to retire? They're not paying into a retirement system. There's no Social Security. They don't get any health care out of that or any of the rest of it. And this is half the population operating like that. That is far too large a number of the population to be operating under the table in terms of payment. And there is a long historic disenfranchisement in Mexico. Now, land tenure refers to who owns the land, not as a question mark, as a statement. And if you look at that map of Mexico, you can see that Mexico is a very rugged country, as we've already discussed before. It's mostly mountainous. And because of that, that limits arable land. Arable land is land that's suitable for agriculture. The best arable land is flat land, and you can see that Mexico does not have a lot of that. And then in addition to that, when the Spanish arrived, they brought in something called the encomienda system. The encomienda system was a system of rewarding loyal Spanish citizens with large land grants. But it was loyal Spanish citizens. And then what those Spanish citizens would do would be pass on these gigantic land grants from one generation to the next. Usually, these large land grants turned into a farm called a hacienda, which mostly was used for grazing. Now, there were obviously already people who lived there. Those people just operated as disenfranchised tenant farmers. And they were allowed to work on the land and grow food for them and their families. But if they caused any problems or they grew more food and were able to make a bigger profit out of this, that entire profit had to go to the person who owned the land, who largely did not even live at the hacienda. That person usually lived in the city. And if that person would find out that these people were skimming off food or money, then that person would come and either throw them off the land, because these people had no rights to the land, or else would come and bring some very unpleasant people with him and beat some heads and let people know that this is not the way it works. And unfortunately for Mexico, this went on for hundreds of years, where a handful of people controlled everything, and most people did not control their own destiny. They did not control their own land. They could not pass on land from one generation to the next.